Well, here we are, season 5.
Season numero 5.
Of Beyond the Pew. Pastor Eric Gill.
Pastor Bruce Rosa.
It is good to be with everybody. We have heard from a lot of people in the church that they were really looking forward to this particular season.
And now it's here. We're back.
It is here.
We're back. It's like Christmas in October.
Yes, there was a little bit of a hiatus there. We took a little bit of a break over the summer, and we're back here for the fall.
Vacation. You were all over the world.
Yes.
You are back at it.
I was not all over the world. I was not.
But you went somewhere.
Just with the family. And so
Good,
we're glad
good.
to be back, though.
But
And
we're
we
back.
are not alone as we kick off season 5.
We're starting with a superstar today.
A superstar.
Yeah, absolutely.
Very good.
We got to
Very
start
good.
strong today.
Excellent. Excellent.
Yeah.
Pastor Eric, why don't you tell us who our guest is today?
Absolutely. Today we have the very own James Dawson. So, James,
Yes.
why don't you tell us a little bit about who you are?
Yeah, good morning.
Good morning.
Thanks for having me on. Who am I? I've been coming to Maranatha for about 12, 13 years now. This church means a lot to me. I was saved here, been a Christian for about 10 years. And, from my occupation, I'm a financial advisor. And I've just gone on this journey of, integrating faith and finance, which I believe is the topic for today. But yeah, I've just loved being a part of this church. I grew up, Bruce, you were in the young adult ministry when I first started coming here, and now I see you leading it. So it's just amazing to see how much changes in 10 years.
No, for sure. Now, James, you said you came to know Christ while at Maranatha. Can you, in a brief summary, share what that looked like as far as you coming to the church? Why were you here? And how did you come to know Christ when you were here?
Yeah, I was invited.
Okay.
And I didn't take it too serious at first. I was into sports and school, back in high school. And, I always had this little bit of a draw that, I should be going to church. I always kind of felt like that. And then when I started getting invited, it was awesome. I was just going to the service. I was coming in and out and not getting too connected, right? And then somewhere along the lines, I was maybe 2 to 3 years here at Maranatha. It was Trent Maybury. He asked me how long I've been saved. And I said, I have no idea, what you're talking about. What does that mean? Yeah. And he's like, we got to meet. So we started meeting at Panera each week and really trying to go through this journey of what salvation looks like and just what's beyond a church service and a relationship with God. And then I had all these questions about, the Bible and just connecting the dots with everything. And I just remember, I was about 20 years old, and, I just lined up all these questions I had, and he just answered them all. And then I just remember kind of shutting my Bible and saying, so you're telling me that all of this is true? And I could really believe that this is true. And he's like, absolutely. And then I just kind of pushed the Bible, and I remember just thinking, I totally believe it. I believe it for everything at its face value, and I'm all in. What's next? And then I started getting a little bit more connected from there.
That's awesome. Yeah, that's exciting to hear.
That's
great.
The cool thing about James, too, my first interaction with James was when I first got hired. I visited a small group for the middle school, and here, my first weekend, walk into this church. One of the members of our church walked to his house, and there is James dealing with middle school and doing exactly the same thing that Trent was doing with him. He was doing it with the middle school, just answering questions and walking through them through the same thing. And so it's like the beautiful picture of multiplying and doing with them what they did to you. And so, James, we're excited for you to be here. You said earlier that right now your role as a financial advisor and how you're trying to integrate faith with finances. And so I think that today we want to talk about a little bit about generosity and contentment, two topics that are important and often as Christians we can be quick to dismiss. And so in your experience, both in your career but also in your personal life, why will you say these two things are so important?
I think it's a big misunderstanding generally when it comes to faith and finances. We look at the Bible as a place to run to for prayer and faith and salvation, and then we kind of lump our jobs, our workplace, into this other bucket of, like the separation of church and state. And, we've got our jobs and we've got our money, and then we've got church and we've got faith. And it's almost like giving was, in my view, when I was early on as a Christian, it was like a tax almost. It was a tax of something you needed to do to be right with God. But I realized through the years of studying the Bible and seeing how much it has to say about money, there's a lot to be said about it, and a lot of gain and benefits from giving and generosity. So it's been a really awesome journey. And then, just me as a financial advisor, I've been in a really unique position to help people with their finances and guide them through. And for a lot of people, they're trying to answer these simple questions in life, like, will I be okay? How much is enough? Like, how much do I need? What's reasonable? What should I be doing with my income? And what I've seen is the full spectrum of people that have millions of dollars and they're miserable, right? And it doesn't satisfy, right? And then you've got people that are just trying to start out and make it, and helping set the foundation for them on, what God is calling it for them in their lives. Like, I think generosity is one of the great opportunities for people like us in the secular world to be able to make an impact for Christ.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that's a huge point, I think, for everybody to consider is giving to the Lord, being generous. One is commanded, right? Scripture commands it, but it's not a task or a tax. It's a opportunity, right? It's a privilege. It's an act of worship. In many ways, our giving to the Lord is a spiritual act of worship, because we're showing forth, God, this isn't mine, it's yours. We're showing forth we have open hands, right, about anything that we think is ours, that only comes from God, and that we're saying to the Lord, use this how you see best, how you see fit, because we want to worship you. We trust you. But I think it's a great point that you point out that there's a separation in people's minds sometimes from the Bible speaks about church things. The Bible has direct impact about my spiritual living, but not necessarily about my practical day-to-day outside of the walls of the church living. And so that's just not true. It does have so much to speak about all those areas of life. And so I think it's a great point that you point that out, because a lot of people can forget that, or they dismiss that as unnecessary to incorporate what do the scriptures teach about these areas, because we kind of have this silo of our money a lot of times in our minds that's ours, and we don't want anybody to touch that, including God sometimes.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's just definitely a good point.
Yeah. Now, you see with generosity and contentment, there's two different things, obviously. Like generosity, a lot of times is tied in with like giving, and contentment, it's more than just happiness. It's more like a state of mind. That is not influenced by circumstance, but nonetheless, do you find that there is a connection between being generous and being content? Is there a connection between the two? Have you seen that in your experience as an advisor? Do you see a connection in the Bible that you can point people to? What has been your experience?
Yeah, I think one of the things I'm constantly sharing with people is that giving breaks the power of money in your life. And it basically, like, money can just chain you down. We're in this materialistic world where we can buy almost anything on Amazon and it'll be shipped to our house in one day, right? And it's really easy to accumulate, and there's so many nice things that you can purchase today. And it's a little bit of a trap in the point of, like, we see all of these unlimited resources of what we can do with our money, and it leads to this life of lack of contentment. Like, it happened to me, and that's why I'm so passionate about this, is because God really worked in my life in the same way, and now I'm seeing Him apply what He did to me that I can guide other people with. And it's this idea that money's not going to be the source of contentment. You can have a lot or a little, and people who have barely any money, they're struggling with anxiety, making paycheck by paycheck, and other people have so much money that they're struggling with this unlimited resources. And should I buy a boat, or should I upgrade my house, or should I have a nicer car? And it just leads to this life of just meaningless, like chasing after the wind. And, what I share with them is giving is this incredible opportunity for where it'll benefit us today. It'll break this power of money over your lives, where it all of a sudden isn't ours. It reminds us that it belongs to God, right? But it also is an opportunity, and I share with people about this idea of two treasuries, right? You've got your earthly treasury, your bank account here, and then you've got your heavenly treasury, where giving, if you look at Scripture, it talks about how it's lending to the Lord, right? With promises to be repaid, and the measure you use is the measure that'll be given back to you. And there's all of these different things that are just so clear if you actually study the Bible, that when you're giving, you're actually investing in what eternal life will be like. And I'm working with these people that have way more money than they'd ever need, and I'm helping equip them to see that, hey, it's time to start investing in your eternal treasury. And even the people that don't have all of their money taken care of yet, you don't want to put that off. I'm like, start giving now, because you got to get this invested in the kingdom, right? You can't outgive God, right? Everything belongs to him. And it's this idea that the sooner you can get involved doing this, like the sooner the Lord can, take your seeds and grow them into a fruitful life, right? Where so many people are getting choked out today by the worries and the options of the world.
Yeah, and that's what you're saying echoes what Jesus said, right? When Jesus said, "Do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal, but lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where moth and rust do not destroy and thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also." So what you're sharing is, in many ways, the same sentiment that Jesus shared when he encouraged those that were listening and following after him. This world is temporary, and it is so hard. I think it's so hard for the believer and the unbeliever, but the believer even, who knows of the things to come, to wrap our head around this is not all there is, because we are so focused on what we can gain in this world, what we can have now, and this idea of delayed gratification, or this idea of looking not at what is in the here and now, but what is to come. That perspective is what Paul had as the means of being able to endure the hardship that he would face in this world, is that he's setting his mind and affections not on things on the earth, but things that are above, things that are to come, which led him to the statement that he made, "The sufferings of this present day aren't worthy to be compared with the glory that will be revealed in us." And so that perspective is not a new perspective. That's a perspective that Jesus taught. That's a perspective that Paul taught. And yet it's one that I think oftentimes we can forget and we can just dismiss because we're so wrapped up in the things of the world.
Yeah. It's like the parable that Jesus shared of the rich fool that he had stored up so many goods that his barn was full.
Yep.
And he said, you know what, let me build an even bigger one so I can have more things to stir up in there. So he did. He built up a bigger farm, and he put more things in there. And then when he filled that one too, he said, okay, now it's time for me to drink, eat, and be merry. And then God said to him, you fool, your life is now be taken away from you. And then he dies, right?
Yeah.
And so what was all that work for? It's just for nothing, like you said. Why waste your entire life storing things on this earth that soon will pass away, like chasing after the wind? How ridiculous is that? I like that what Proverbs says too. In Proverbs 11:24, it says, "One gives freely, yet grows all the richer. Another withholds what he should give, and only suffers once. Whoever brings blessings will be enriched, and one who waters will himself be watered." Kind of talks about the blessings of the person that is more prone to give rather than the person that is quicker to hold.
Now, James, can I ask a question just as a follow-up? Because you had mentioned the word contentment and about people who have millions of dollars. They have all the things. They don't know what to do with their money. Should I buy a boat? Should I buy another house? Whatever it may be. So for people listening, what you're saying is, because there's this perception. People have this perception that if I just had more money, if I just had the ability to, what you said, buy whatever I want, I'd be content. And what you're saying is you have seen the reality that that is not the case, that just because people have the ability or wealth to buy whatever they want, they're still not content. Is that what you're saying?
That's exactly what I'm saying. And you look at the Bible, And the majority of the stories in the Bible are warnings about people with high financial stability. It's actually dragging them away from their relationship with God, right? And you look at that, and and I broke it down as like a four square where, you're either heading towards God or you're heading away from God. And then you either have high financial stability or low financial stability. And then you look at the examples where in the Bible where money is talked about and, people are moving towards God, it's always examples of people who are displaying acts of low financial stability, right? The poor widow or, Zacchaeus and all these people who gave all of their money away in effort to, make an impact for the ministry of Christ, right? And you see that all of these instances of praise from God is people actually working themselves down to this bottom tier of low financial stability, but moving toward God. When everybody in this world, like we want to be in this upper right corner of high financial stability and rich relationship with God, but there really isn't any examples in the Bible that highlight that. And it's because, you look at the scriptures and it talks about how you cannot serve both money and God.
Yeah.
Right? And when I read that the first time, like in my mind, I read it as it's very hard to serve money and God. And that is not what it says. It says you literally cannot. So you cannot be in that top right corner of high financial stability where everything is taken care of in life and expect to have a rich relationship with God. It's just not like where your treasure is, so is your heart, right?
Yeah.
Just as you had shared. So if people's treasure is in their bank account, their millions of dollars, right? It's not in God.
Sure. And I think the key there, what you had mentioned there, is if that's what their treasure is, right? Because there are a lot of examples of individuals who have great wealth, but with their wealth, they have sought to honor the Lord.
Yeah.
I mean, I think of Joseph of Arimathea and think of individuals that in the Bible you would have this perception that they probably were pretty wealthy, but they were using that wealth to honor the Lord. So their treasure wasn't in that. They weren't grasping tightly onto that to hold on to it. And I think that's where, Jesus even clarified that the love of money is the root of all evil. And so if there's a grasping and holding on, but here's what I think is true too with what you're saying, that becomes people's identity, right? So if someone's identity is their wealth, if their goal in life is, I want to be a wealthy person, that's their goal. It is very difficult to have a goal of I want to be whatever it may be, whether a wealthy person or someone who is a popular person or someone who is a powerful person. If the focus is on what I want to be and not on what does God want me to be, what does Christ want me to be, that can become an idol in our lives. And a lot of times money can become an idol for people that they're exalting it as such a priority, and it consumes them, and people get consumed by wealth. And that's a dangerous thing because it does become an idol in our lives, and it detracts from our relationship with Christ so often.
Yeah, and if I can just share something with that is, one of the most common things as I'm talking to people that they'll quote from Scripture is that, doesn't God want a joyful giver, right? And it's like, I don't feel that joyful when I'm giving, so maybe it's not a spiritual gift of mine. Or maybe, I'm called to pay off my debts or pay off my house or whatever before I really start giving. These are the common things that I hear, right? And if you think about it, it's so, one of the ways that I try to explain this is that a lot of times your feelings come after the action. So, if you're struggling in your marriage, a counselor would not say, just start saying that you love each other and then the feelings will come. They're going to say, start doing things that show love for each other, and then the love will come. So in the same way, giving, I'm not, I didn't feel like a joyful giver when I first started giving. I hated it. And I was thinking about how long it would take me to sit at work to make that same amount of money that I was giving, and it's just all the wrong things, right? And then I started doing it, and then realizing that I was part of, the greatest story to ever exist, like God's kingdom evolving in this story. And then all of a sudden it's like my heart shifted to someone who loved to give and increase my giving. But I had to just take the first step out and do it, even if it was a little bit begrudging. and I wasn't doing it like maybe as joyful at the very beginning. The feelings came after, and I always just encourage people, just try it.
Yeah.
Just try it and then see what happens, because maybe you're not joyful now, but I think you'll get there.
Yeah. And that's something that we have to rely on the Lord, right, to give us that joy and give us that. I mean, when we talk about this area of generosity, I think of Philippians 4. People know Philippians 4:13. It says, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me.
Yeah.
The context of Paul saying that is in the context of contentment.
Mm-hmm.
And so he talks about in Philippians 4 how he's been in positions where he has been in want, where he's had needs, and he's had nothing in his life as far as to sustain him and to provide for him. And there's been times in his life where he's had extreme abundance, where he has had so much that he has more than he needs. And he said, I have found the secret of contentment. I have learned the secret of facing plenty and hunger, abundance and need. He's learned the secret of contentment. And he said, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. Mm-hmm. And so we look at that passage a lot of times when we're like, I'm going to charge that hill and I'm going to defeat the giants in my life. I can do all things through Christ. Paul specifically mentions that verse in the context of contentment in the midst of having plenty and also in the midst of having nothing, that it's only through Christ that he has the strength to be content and have that sense of contentment in his life. And so I think what you're sharing is spot on in the sense that so often we think of ourselves and we don't realize this is for the work of the Lord that we're committing to, and Christ sustains us in doing that. So some great points. I think it's great.
Well, and I think too, like, to be practical, like, I feel like we're very good at making excuses. We're very good at like psyching ourselves out from doing what we're supposed to do. When it comes to spending money, or when it comes to like buying what we want to buy, we have no problem in doing that. But when it comes to like things that like tithing and doing things for the Lord, well, at that moment, then we're more hesitant. Okay, well, we got to do this, we got to do that. But when it comes to like maybe do a Starbucks run, maybe go to Walmart, maybe get this thing, that thing, like, we're not as reluctant, and yet, like, for the things of the Lord, we are.
Sure.
And that just shows, like, the heart of the individual. Now, James, a few weeks ago or about a month ago, you were involved in teaching in the young adult ministry in the Sunday school, and you talked about generosity. And one of the questions was, like, how do you figure out the proper amount that you should tithe? And it was like an impromptu question that was asked, and the way that you answered, I thought it was pretty insightful, very challenging too. It was about how do you figure out that amount, and you said something that for me was actually a first. And you talk about how do you arrive at 10%. Do you remember what I'm talking about? Mm-hmm. You mind sharing about that, because there might be a listener here today that they're either trying to figure out their tithing, or maybe they've been doing it in a different way. This could be an area that they themselves could be challenging too.
Yeah, I think the stat is that 1 of every 8 people who say that they're tithing are actually tithing. And that means the other 7 of the 8 think that they're tithing, but they're not, which is just a sign that there needs to be a little bit of education on how you actually go about thinking about this, right? So what most people think about is they get whatever their take-home pay is, whatever they're getting every 2 weeks, and then they'll multiply that by 10%, and they think that they're tithing, right? But they forget that, the tithe is your first fruits, right? It's supposed to be the very first income that comes in, the very first thing under your gross income is supposed to be your giving. So when you look at your net paycheck, that's after taxes, that's after, retirement contributions, benefits. It's after a lot of different things. And, a lot of times if you're tithing at 10%, on your net income, you're probably only giving maybe 5 or 6%. And then when you actually, when I educate and I say it's based on your gross income, a lot of times people don't know how to calculate that. So that could be their salary, if they're aware of what their salary is. A lot of people don't know what their salary is. They're like, well, I know I make $20 an hour. I'm like, well, you just need to take your hourly wage, multiply it by 2,080, because that's the amount of hours we work in a full week, across the year. And that's what your salary is, and that's what you should take as the numerator to figure out, you're a true tithe. And then I share from there is really, I think the misconception has been that 10% giving is the goal. And it's actually really the training wheels. If you look at Scripture, it's like Jesus came and rose the bar for everything, right? Old Testament, there was actually 3 different tithes. Most people aren't aware of that. So the Israelites were giving like about 23% per year among 3 different tithes. One of them was just every 3 years, right? So 23% on average. And then, Jesus reaffirmed the tithe in the New Testament, but he rose the bar. He said, yes, you should tithe, but don't forget about, justice, mercy, and some of the greater things that people were forgetting. And we think that, the tithe is like the golden standard. And it's just not true. It's really the training wheels for what God is calling us in our lives. Is like, hey, it's a great place to start, but see, is the Lord blessing you with your giving and in your income, right? And that's what I'm guiding my clients on, is this idea of lifestyle creep. It's like, there's nothing wrong with $100,000 salary. What's wrong is thinking if you make $100,000, you need to spend $100,000, right? So what I'm helping people young in their careers, as they're making less money, is set these limits in your life where, you're good with, a house of this price or a car like this, and, you don't need to constantly upgrade your life, right? So when your income increases over time, you're actually creating this additional margin and allowing yourself to give potentially much further than a typical 10% tithe, with your margin that's growing, instead of what most people think is, as my income increases, I can go ahead and upgrade my car or upgrade my house. And, there's just nothing in Scripture that encourages that.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think a lot of people, back to the issue of the tithe, they consider any giving to be tithing.
Mm-hmm.
Like when people use the terminology, I tithe, they a lot of times they associate any kind of giving to the church with tithing. And I don't think a lot of people have the understanding that a tithe literally means 10% when you talk about a tenth, a tithe. But a lot of people just associate any kind of giving, that's my tithe because I give. And so they associate that word with any kind of giving. So not only is the issue, again, what you were mentioning about your gross versus net income and where you're starting that from, but I think a lot of people as well just associate any kind of giving with tithing and miss, the example, and even the Old Testament example, as you mentioned, where there was significantly more than a tenth of money that was being given for the work in the temple and the priests and all the things that were taking place. But people, I think, miss that. And so I agree with you, too. We tend to have kind of silos of where we expect giving to come from as well. And I think that's one of the things, too, that Jesus, I think, revolutionized the thinking as well. It's not just enough to look at our giving when it comes to finances, but also in our time and also in what we're investing ourselves into and what we're giving, obviously with financial matters. But a lot of people then forget the fact that, yeah, that's true. But in addition to that, what Jesus was mentioning is, okay, what are you investing your life into as well? And so when you start to look at the giving that we would want to give to God with our finances, and then you go beyond that and saying, not only does he want us and expect us to do that as an act of worship, he wants your very life, right? And so what follows a life that is committed to the Lord is that he's going to have everything that's in that life. And so I believe one of the reasons why this is an area of giving that's so hard for so many people is they're failing first to recognize it's not just your finances that he wants. And I should even say that a different way. It's not just your finances that you want. It's not just your finances that is reasonable to give to the Lord. It's your very life that should be given to the Lord, which begins to speak of some of the motivations of the heart that you've been talking about, is that people, they are so invested in so many things and they think, well, as long as I've given my tithe or given my 10% or whatever it may be, this other stuff belongs to me. Really what Jesus taught was that everything belongs to the Lord.
Yeah.
Everything. And when we have that perspective, maybe it doesn't seem as big of a weightiness to us that means my finances too.
Yeah.
And everything does belong to the Lord.
Paul put it this way in Romans 12:1. He says, I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship.
Yeah.
Highlighting what you're saying, Bruce, about he wants all of us.
Yeah.
Not just part of components of us. He wants our whole being.
Yes.
And that picture of a living sacrifice, an individual that is choosing to walk to the altar, voluntarily walking to hey, here I am at your disposal, surrendering to you all I am, all I have, all that I will ever be for you. That's the image that God is requiring of us. And I think, too, when it comes to this idea of generosity or of giving, a lot of times we use the excuses like, well, I'm not gifted in this way, or that's not me. You mentioned earlier, like, that's like, no. Like, let's take a step back. Like, whether you're gifted or not is a commandment for every single believer. Granted, the one that is gifted will give in more amount, but nonetheless, every single one of us is required to do this.
Yeah, and I think that's the other area too that I think sometimes people can push off to say, well, someone else can. People do this in regards to serving with spiritual gifts, right? Someone else will be the one to share the gospel. Someone else will be the one to teach the kids. Someone else will be the one to whatever it may be. Same thing happens when it comes to the giving is, well, clearly they have more ability to give than I do, so let them do it. And I think the example Jesus gave when he looked at the widow that was there and she gave her final pennies that she had to the Lord, and he said, I tell you, she went away to her home justified because she was giving out of her need. She was giving out of all that she had to the Lord versus the one who arrogantly was giving out of his abundance. Mm-hmm. And when we teach about New Testament giving, we talk about how New Testament giving should be planned. So there's a plan in place. We have sought the Lord in this, and we're asking the Lord for direction. It should be regular. It's something that is consistent, that we are consistently seeking to give to the Lord, but also it should be sacrificial. It should cost us something. It should be an act of worship that says to the Lord, I'm willing to do without this so that I can do this as far as for your work and for what you're accomplishing. And sometimes that could be something that you're like, wow, like that cost me something, as it should, though, if we're doing this as an act of worship to the Lord. And I think some people get into a rut. I know it's easy to get into a rut to feel comfortable in what you're doing, as opposed to re-examining and saying, okay, Lord, like what now? How do you want me to give to you and serve you now with my finances? Because that's something that we can tend to be so protective of.
Yeah. And this whole idea is beautiful because one aspect that we haven't highlighted, but is so essential too, is when the church comes together through the giving. I mean, just look at Acts 2. The gospel spreads. Yeah. The believers there, they came together. They sell. I mean, it was a unique situation, but they came together. They started selling all of their possession, all of their properties, and they gave it to the church. And it says that many people believe, and numbers were added to that day. And even though it was a unique situation, nonetheless, you see the principle of like gospel spreading out because people were willing to just give and being part of the work of the Lord is doing. James, as we get into a moment of wrapping things up, let's just highlight this idea of contentment. In your experience, what are some things that we should keep in mind when it comes to contentment, the connections between generosity and contentment? What's some things that we should be mindful about?
Well, you mentioned earlier about happiness versus contentment, right? And I always think about almost like a roller coaster where like happiness and sadness are like the mountain peaks, right? And the valleys, right? And contentment is like the bulldozer that just flattens the whole mountain, where you're content at the mountain, you're content in the valley, because you know that Christ is with you through all of it, right? And that is like the secret to life is if you can achieve contentment where you're at, you know, you could have this rich relationship with God. So, you know, you ask, like, practically speaking, like, how do you do that? And that's kind of what I've been teaching on. You know, a lot of it is like actually creating rules in your life. Like in this world of unlimited options and choices, and it's so easy to take out debt to make a purchase, you know, and leverage, you know, and all of these different things. You have to be able to have some discipline. You mentioned delayed gratification. You know, Proverbs talks about how that's praised by God. Mm. You know, it's a lost art on us today, but it's something that like I focus on is basically I have this set of rules that I sat down with my wife and we did some family planning, and we created rules in our lives for our finances and what's reasonable. And that's what I would challenge people to think about. So, you know, maybe it's a certain dollar amount. Like, you know, it would be unreasonable for me to ever own a car over $50,000. And then, if I see a brand new amazing car and it costs more than that, I can basically look at that and say, wow, that is an amazing car. I'm not pursuing that, and I'm perfectly okay with it. That's contentment. It's like discovering that you're perfectly okay with not pursuing something of the world, even if you could afford it potentially, right? So, and other people are like, well, it's hard to slap a dollar amount on it because there's inflation, and how can I really do that on a long-term basis? Well, maybe you can create a rule in your life for what reasonable purchase looks like. So, an example of what we did, I was looking, I'm a realtor too, so I sell houses, and I see these beautiful houses, and it just makes me like shake at the idea of living in a house like that, with his and her closets and this beautiful, like all of these beautiful things. And I'm like, wow, it would be amazing to have something like that. And I see, my peers or other people purchasing these, and I start thinking, should I have that too, right? And the answer is, is there a legitimate need for it, right? So what my wife and I did was we created this rule for ourselves: is we're not going to purchase a house unless we have enough kids to fill each bedroom. And so I didn't apply a certain dollar amount that we would never go over a $300,000 house, but instead we've got this rule. Right now we don't have any kids, so we live in a 2-bedroom, 1-bathroom duplex, and it's perfectly okay with us right now. And it helps me as I see these houses or see these things that I could buy, basically say, you know what, my own rules is I'm not going to pursue that because God has not given me the children to fill that room, and I'm perfectly okay with that. And that's been like the sense of contentment that I've been able to discover, where even if you have the ability to make the purchase, you don't necessarily need to do it. And then all of a sudden you've got this margin in your life that you can increase your giving significantly and do it joyfully. And I guess that would be a challenge, I would say, to anybody, is that 10% tithe, right? The rich relationship that you're going to discover with God is when you go above and beyond that, right? It's like you think about the 10% as the standard or something that you should do, and then as long as you're there, you're good, right? You just slap on a tithe, and then the other 90% is yours, right? If you want to really discover the rich relationship with God, you've got to go beyond it. You got to get a little bit uncomfortable, and it should really cost you something. Bruce, is what you were saying. And that is like where I've been discovering, and I've just had this just increasing growth in my relationship with the Lord, because we are becoming more sacrificial with our giving. And then the feelings of the joy are just growing, right? Each time we give more and more. And my wife and I would love to just, every time we do it, we'll either send a text or an email, and we just, like in all bold, we just say it's an excellent investment in eternity. And it just reminds me every single time that, it's not just flushing money down the drain, but you're actually investing it somewhere else, and there'll be a return on that in God's timing. And, invest in the line, not the dot of the life you're with. But like, it's just so easy to be content when you have this long-term perspective of eternal life. And then just knowing the reality that, having this nicer house or this nicer car is not really going to give you happiness. It's actually going to give you a more complicated life, where you need to make more money just to maintain it and to fill it with stuff and to pay the property tax. It's just not worth it. And then, you get people coming to your house or something that you have nice, and they look at you and they're like, is that really a good reflection of Christ, with that property? And I would be almost embarrassed to have something so nice that people are questioning my relationship with the Lord, based on what I have, right? So it's not that we're called to poverty. In fact, there's a lot of verses that talk about how God wants us to enjoy what he's given us.
Sure.
Right? So it's a balance for sure, where not every dollar you spend, you should feel a sense of guilt. But if you can create these rules in your life and just stick to them, you're going to find that sense of peace and really be able to discover generosity.
Yeah, and awesome. I think two things with that. One, with what you were just saying towards the end there, we probably all are familiar with people that we know who have great wealth and either flaunt that wealth as look what I've gained, look what I have done, versus those that have maybe great wealth but have said, listen, God has blessed us, and we are seeking to use what God has given to us to bless other people, right? We know both extremes. I mean, in the Bible, in particular in the Old Testament scriptures, you had so many people who were so wealthy, and it was because God increased their wealth, because there was a standard that obedience would bring blessing and disobedience would bring cursing. And this was God's covenant that he made, in the Old Testament, that if you will honor me, if you will follow me, I will bless you. And that blessing we see in the Old Testament fulfilled itself in many riches and lands and cattle and all of these things that God provided. But that's when the nation of Israel had to be on its guard, because when they had plenty, they began to trust in themselves rather than in the Lord.
Yeah.
And that's the danger even present day with believers that have much, is if that source becomes our source of contentment or striving or glory is what we have rather than the Lord who's given it, that's a dangerous thing. And so, and then, excuse me, the other thing I would say too, there is a sense that people have, in order to be generous, you have to have great wealth. And that's just not true, right? So a lot of people think, well, if God would just give me a bunch of riches, then I'd be more than generous with it. There's not a standard of generosity that is only based upon if you're wealthy, right? And again, the widow is a prime example where she came and she cast in all that she had. And Jesus said she gave more than the one who gave out of his abundance. And so just for people listening too, there's not this standard that God has that you have to measure up to a certain dollar amount to show forth that you're being generous. It's, are you giving to God with what he has given to you first? And for everybody, that might be much different than the person that you're sitting next to in a pew on Sunday morning, but it's not in the amount, right? It's in the sacrifice. It's in the giving it to the Lord. And so I think we just want to clarify that as well. You don't have to be wealthy to be generous.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes that's a misconception.
And if I can add to that, like I share with a lot of people that it's a lot harder to give $3,000 when you make $30,000 than to give $10,000 when you make $100,000.
Sure.
Right? Because you've got additional resources. So that example, is giving only for the wealthy. It's actually not, right? And you look at the parable of the talents, and God gives people different talents. Like not everybody is called to make a ton of money, right? But at the end of that parable, I just love it. He says, to the one that he gave 3 or 5 or 10, he said, "Well done, my good and faithful servant. You've been faithful over little. I'll set you faithful over much in heaven.
Yes.
Come enjoy, your Father's kingdom." And it's just so amazing. I encourage people. It's like, you don't need to be the one with the 10 talents. And I think in a lot of cases, we may be surprised that we are the ones with the 10 talents. If you make over 50,000, you're in the top 10% of the whole world of wealth, right? So, maybe more of us than we think are, in that 10 talent range. But it's that idea that it doesn't matter how much you gave. He's looking for faithfulness in little. Mm-hmm. So money can be viewed as like a blessing, but it can equally be viewed as a test.
For sure.
Yeah.
That's great. Yeah, good insights.
Yeah. James, thank you so much for being part of this and your insight. I think it's also very encouraging that you're young and you're passionate about this. I know that your lessons in the Young Adult Ministry was very impactful for our group, and I know that the listeners of the podcast all over the world,
all around the world, James,
challenged and encouraged. And so, James, there's a question though we ask at the end of each podcast. Do you know what that question is?
I'm not aware.
James,
you were doing so well.
Season 5, you were doing starting so well.
You were doing so well.
So the question that we ask all the time is, what does your life look like beyond the pew? And we hope it is honoring to the Lord, to our listeners. And so we'll be back. We'll be back with another episode. James, thank you again for being here.
Much,
Great
James.
insights.
Great insight.
And I hope you'll be back with us next week.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.